So what are we going to do today? We're going to look at data. On a scale of like here to here, how familiar are people with Barna Group? Unfamiliar, that's fine. On a scale from here to here, how comfortable are we with data? Great. So let me introduce Barna Group to you. Barna Group's mandate is to navigate the times, understand the times, and know what to do. Our goal in the world is to equip Christian leaders with the skills, the knowledge, and the vision needed to navigate change. So we are a social and research research firm, originally based out of Southern California. And we work with organizations, denominations, Christian nonprofits around the globe to help navigate with research and with data what's going on in the world today. What is that thing that we're all feeling? And using numbers and social science to illuminate what we're all experiencing, the common threads that tie our experiences together in a research and data-based way. So to do that, we conduct survey research, qualitative research, all around the country and even all around the globe, and my job is to oversee that. It really is a meaningful work, and at the end of the day, what really matters is what's happening in local communities like this one, and so it's always a privilege to be among you. Today, what we're going to do is walk through, as titled, 7 Contemporary Myths, and I'm going to explain what that means in just a minute. But one of the things I like to do before starting into a data presentation is to give a bit of an idea of who am I in comparison to who are you. There's this great framework by an organizational psychologist named Adam Grant that says every job in the world exists on 2 spectrums. One spectrum is the method of your job, and the other is the mission of your job. And so on the left axis of your method, you might be working with belief, and on the right axis, you might be working with evidence. On the y-axis of the mission of your work, you might be working to win, victory, or you might be on the mission of truth. So what's in the bottom left? What job in the world is driven by belief and its goal is to win? That's a politician. You're trying to convince people of something to believe, and we're trying to win. Believe what I'm saying, join into my charisma, and we're going to win. If your goal is to win, but you're using evidence, I would say that you're a prosecutor. The goal is to use evidence to a certain outcome. Now, you all live in the top left of this paradigm, where you're using belief to move people towards truth. Gospel truth, divine truth, but we're doing that through belief. We're doing that through stories of the Gospels and the Old Testament. We're doing that through church tradition. Whereas I sit in the top right of this, where I'm using evidence to point people towards truth. And so that exists, that kind of illuminates our partnership. We're all trying to work towards people understanding truth about who are they in the eyes of God, who are they in the eyes of community. I'm trying to illuminate how everybody is experiencing the world today, whereas you're trying to move them into healthier and more flourishing, more interconnected with the Lord relationships and states of being. Another way to express what I do is I'm trying to connect the macro to the micro. I'm trying to say, this is what's going on out there, and here's what it might look like in your community. Or, here's what's going on in your community, and here's how many people are experiencing that in the world today. So establishing that connection. Make sense? Great. So, what's a myth? This talk is titled Contemporary Myths. And when I first started in this work at Barna Group, we talked a lot about our job being Mythbusters, like the old TV show. In the TV show Mythbusters, they would take a story you'd heard, whether in a movie or an old, folk tale, and they'd put science to it and say, is that true? Does that really work? Does that happen the way you think it's happening? This talk was actually first my definition. The definition you can find if you Google for mythology is a pattern of beliefs expressing often symbolically the characteristic or prevalent attitudes in a group or a culture. Read it one more time. A pattern of beliefs, often symbolic, that express the characteristic or prevalent attitudes in a group or a culture. A few different things going on there. We're going to walk through it. This talk was actually inspired by time I got to spend 2 years ago at this location. Anybody familiar with it? This is the Acropolis of Athens, Greece. I had the opportunity to visit a friend who was living there as a missionary, and got to spend about 10 days exploring the city, exploring some of the Greek islands. And I was so interested in Greek history, especially because you visit all these locations throughout Greece, and there's these mythologies, these stories attached to the physical locations. The story of Athens in mythology was that there was a contest between Poseidon and Athena, and they offered gifts to the people of Athens, not then named Athens, that was going to determine which god would oversee the city of Athens. Poseidon offered a fountain, and Athena offered the olive tree. And the Athenians went to pick Athena and say, this gift is greater, this gift is better for us and who we want to be. So the city is named Athens, we are Athenians. Now, at that moment in Greek history, what was going on was that at that point, the Greek people who originated from some of the southern islands of the Mediterranean had spent hundreds of years being a naval people. They conquered moving around the oceans in boats and warfare in the water, and they were finally finding a home, and they were moving to agriculture. And so there's a myth about the gods that then organizes how they make that shift, because they say to Poseidon, well, we don't need a fountain, we don't need water, we've already conquered the seas. What we need is the olive tree to represent that we're an agricultural people now, and that we are a people of the earth. And so they organize around this story, and it's the story that they tell to their children, their grandchildren, to explain who are we. We're agricultural now, we're no longer naval-based, and this then pivots Greek history towards building huge temples on the ground rather than when they were at sea, they weren't building like that. And so now you can go visit these sites and to touch these walls and understand that history that all was organized around stories. What's so fascinating about a site like this, too, is that when you're visiting it, you can see how it's changed over the course of 2,000 years. There were churches at points, Christian churches, raised on this same platform. When the Romans were very pagan, but they controlled Greece and Athens, they had their own temples here that have since been destroyed. The organizing story changed over time as the religion did, and the stories communicated who they were. I think some of the same things still happen today. We have organizing stories of who are we. And so a very simple definition to think about how I would express is that myths are organizing stories that communicate values of a group or a culture. So a group has values, they want to communicate them, they need a story to go along with it. We do this with our own lives, of how we communicate who we are, with our values, with our stories. We do this in our churches. How do we communicate who we are? And we organize around these stories. And after 7 years of being in this work at Barna Group, what I can tell you is I hear a lot of stories about the church. Maybe you can ask yourself, what myths exist within the church today? What stories do you hear about the church and about Christians today? And maybe you can even ask yourself, what narratives exist within your church or your ministry? What are those organizing stories? What stories would we say we operate around? The myths I hear in my work as I get to work with organizations, denominations all around the globe, all around the country, I hear stories like, well, Christians are a minority. I hear stories like, no one knows who Jesus is anymore. I hear things like Christian leaders are infallible. Next generations are on the way out. Churches have never been emptier than they are today. Vocational ministry is being replaced with bivocational ministry. Pastors are burning out unlike any other job sector. The church is irrelevant. Secularism is overtaking the world. I'm not saying that these are true or untrue. I'm telling you that these are the stories I hear wherever I go, whether it's in a church this size, whether it's in a mega church, whether it's in a local Christian homeless shelter. These are the stories I hear all over the globe. And so my job as a researcher who lives in that top right box is to go look for the evidence. Go say, if that's happening, how is it happening? How would we know that that's true? How would we use data? How would we use representative listening to understand, is that true? And then based on what we learn, what are we then compelled to do? So what I want to walk through today is 7 different myths, things I hear on the church, some of those that are on that slide before. And what I want to do collectively today is a 3-step process. This is kind of a researchy process. But first I want to acknowledge, what story are we telling? What is that myth? Second, I want to ask, what's the truth of this story? How true is that? On a scale of 0 to 10 or 0 to 100, how true is that story? And then I want to reorient. What's a more accurate story? Maybe what's a more helpful story? So that's the journey we're about to go on. Are you guys ready for data? It's a little overwhelming at first, like a fire hose, but I hope that we can keep up. Really excited to share this with you. So myth number 1, Christianity is in decline. Who's heard this? Overwhelmingly so. We hear that the church is on the decline. I heard, somebody sent me a news clip a few weeks ago where a news anchor was starting a story about a local church, and he started his story by saying, everybody knows that the Christian church has been in decline since the crucifixion of Jesus. Since the crucifixion. Don't worry about anything that came after that. But these are the stories we hear, aren't they? Christianity is in decline. So, okay, if that's true, how would we know? Well, at Barna Group, we've been doing this long enough that we actually have data. You might have to squint if you're in the back here. I apologize, but I will narrate through it. Where every single year we conduct representative social research where we ask people, would you consider yourself a Christian? We don't ask, what we do ask, but in this data point, we're not talking about, do you go to church? It's not a Nicene Creed or an Apostles' Creed. It's not sacraments. It's just, would you raise your hand and say, I'm a Christian? And what you find in this data is in the early 2000s, going back as far as we have quantitative good tracking on this, about 83% of US adults, not including children, would raise their hand and say, yeah, I'm a Christian, 8 out of 10. Through the late 2010s and into the early 2020s, you see this number consistently going down and to the right, hitting its lowest point just before the pandemic, around 66% of all US adults. So from 8 out of 10 down to 2 out of 3. It's not incredible decline, but it is decline. And this is, I've had to change my talk just a little bit because just this year there's an uptick in Christianity. Today, 74% of US adults consider themselves Christian, which is 8 percentage points higher than just last year. It's worthy of conversation. We can dig into that as we go. But on the whole, we can look at this and say Christian identity is on the decline. What if we thought about it in terms of church attendance? How many people attend church on a weekly basis? We track this number too. In the early 2000s, the red line here is Christians. The bluish line is all US adults. Early 2000s, about 42% of all US adults went to church on a weekly basis. This declines very similarly to Christian identity, down to the right, reaching a low point of 27% in about 2017. Today, it's about 1 out of 3 people who attend church on a weekly basis. That's of everybody, all US adults. If you just narrow down to Christians, today it's only about 42% of all Christians who go to church on a weekly basis. Maybe that feels really high to you, you go, wow, that's a lot of people going to church. Maybe that feels really low to you, where you look at where we were 20 years ago, or you think of our upbringing when we thought of church as being very full every day, and you knew that every person you knew had a home church on a Sunday that they were going to be participating in. So we see this is true here. Church attendance, it's down to the right. We're attending church less and less as a people. This is one of my favorite stats to talk about. We ask at Barna Group not just, do you identify as Christian? Do you go to church? We also ask people on an annual basis, how important is faith to you? This isn't as much about do you go to church, but does faith compel you in your life? Does it help organize your life? Does it help you make decisions? And what we find is that in the year 2000, 74% of Christians and 68% of US adults agreed strongly, my faith is so important to my life today. My faith is very important. So upwards of 74% of Christians said, I'm making decisions because of my faith. I'm organizing my life, I'm giving, I'm doing different things because my faith compels me. Today, of all US adults, only 43% say their religious faith is very important to them, and only about half of Christians say that that's true of them. So maybe we'd say myth confirmed, right? that Christianity is in decline. It doesn't look like it did 20 years ago, and we can all think to ourselves that doesn't probably look like what it did 20 years before that. Let's think a little deeper for a second. These numbers can actually be a little deceiving. This is the population of all US adults over the last 20 years. Starting with 210, this is in hundreds of millions, 100 million US adults lived in the year 2000. Today, the population, this is 2024 because the census hasn't updated their numbers yet, 267 million, 100 million people in the United States today. So if we take this number, and this is, we're going to do some basic math here. If in the year 2000, there were 209 million people and 83% of them identified as Christian, that's 174 million Christians. That's a lot of people, isn't it? If we look at the year 2024, where there are 267 million people, million adults, and 66% of them identify as Christian, that's 176 million Christians. We've grown by 2.2 million people in 20 years. Congratulations. Wait, that's not decline, is it? That's a different story. Are we declining? I think the story is a little more challenging than that. If you're having a hard time with the statistics of this for a second, let me give you an image. US adults, and 32% of them go to church on a weekly basis. That's 85 million people. That's a decline of 2.4 million people. So is church attendance in decline? Yes, to a degree. It's not maybe as stark as that original slide led on, but it is in decline. I really like this number. This is a number for the nerdier ones of us. What proportion of Christians are attending church on a weekly basis? That number is essentially flat. So 50% of Christians go to church on a weekly basis 20 years ago. Today, about 48% of Christians go to church on a weekly basis. So we ask ourselves again, is this decline? It's a bit more up to interpretation. Let's look at it one more way. My religious faith is very important in my life today. 174, we're just looking at Christians here for a second. 174 million Christians in the year 2000, 74% of them say my faith matters to me. It's 128 million people saying my faith compels me, it organizes my life. Today, 176 million Christians, 53% of them say my faith matters to me. That's only 93 million people. That's a loss of 35 million people, million Christians saying my faith matters to me. Now that is decline, and that's a different story. So maybe let's go back to this paradigm of let's acknowledge the story. Christianity is in decline. The truth of the story is that Christianity is relatively unchanged. It's kind of flat, actually, over the last 20 years. If we were to look back about 20 more years beyond that, we'd see about the same thing. That Christianity is actually about flat. It's just not growing with the population. But if we listen a little deeper to what's going on, what we reorient around is that Christians have experienced a crisis of faith. Their faith does not matter to them the way it once did. We're still identifying as Christian. We're still going to church. But there is an incredible crisis of faith happening amongst Christians and amongst all US adults where faith just does not matter to people. You could think of it this way. They still call themselves Christian. They still go to church. They're just not as interested. How do we organize? If this is the organizing story that Christianity is in decline, how do we think a level deeper about it where we go, actually, Christianity is not in decline. Faith is in decline. Spirituality is in decline. Organizing our lives around our faith is what's in decline. Maybe we think differently about how we lead our churches if we acknowledge this reality. Let's move on to the second myth. Churches are closing their doors. Who here has seen a church close in the last 10 years? Absolutely. And especially in the pandemic, we were heard oversaturated with stories of churches closing left and right, real decline of local churches. Let's walk through some numbers on this. So in the year 1980, the estimation by the religious census of organized churches finds that there were, this is Protestant and Catholic numbers here,
that in the year 1980, there were 223,000 churches, physical church buildings. In the year 1990, there were 240,000 physical churches. That's since 1980, 17,000 more churches, a growth of 8%. Somebody want to shout out what they think it is in 2000? Are we going up? Are we going down? Up. 2000 to 2010, incredibly up. By 2010, there are 310,000 Protestant and Catholic churches in the United States of America. That's a growth of 39% since 1980. What about 2020? This data was actually collected mid-pandemic. Up or down? It's up. There are 314,000 Protestant and Catholic churches in the United States today. That's 91,000 more churches than 40 years ago, with 41% growth of the physical church. So are churches closing their doors? It's kind of complicated. Let's ask one other question. Somebody shout out a number for me. In the year 1980, how many denominations do you think there were in the United States? 3,500. Anybody else? In the year 1980, there were 97 distinguished denominations in the United States. Considering that the United States started with about 7 or 8, pretty high increase. 1990, up, down. Through 2010, grows to about 192 individual denominations active in this country. Up or down for the next one? Anybody want to take a guess? What was that? In the year 2020, there are 319 individual denominations in this country. That's a rate of 5 to 6 new organized denominations every year for the last 40 years. So are churches closing their doors? I'll give you one more nerdy number. I like throwing one nerdy number in. How many numbers of Christians per church? You can see it track across time. Today, for every Christian, for every church, there are 582. Why did I get that? Number of churches per Christians per church, 582. So the growth of the church physically is actually outpacing the growth of Christianity. We're getting to a point where we're adding more and more buildings, more and more denominations, despite the fact that the number of Christians is essentially flat over time. Take 10 seconds of self-reflection. Why might that be? What's going on in these numbers? So when I do that and when I think about it, I added one extra slide just for you guys. Which denominations have grown and declined the most in that 40-year period? The Southern Baptists, the Assemblies of God, the Seventh-day Adventists, PCA, and the Evangelical Free Church in America have grown the greatest in those years. The largest losses are all the mainline and Catholic. United Methodist Church lost about 8,500, PCA lost about 3,800. So it's not that churches, I'm not here to say churches are not closing their doors. What you heard is not true. It's that the growth in certain denominations and a certain sect of the church is outpacing the decline on the other side of the church. So when I think back on these numbers, and I look at the fact that we've grown 41% physically in the last 40 years, I come to this conclusion. So the myth is that churches are closing their doors. The reality is that the church has grown 41% in 40 years, but the reorientation is that the church is splintering apart. Division is the decline of the church far faster than disaffiliation is. We're building churches, new sects of Christianity far faster than we are adding more Christians. And we're growing to a place where, when you look at this bottom number here, we're growing to a place where we will have so many churches that we could have more churches than ever, and there might just be 20 people in them, because Christianity isn't growing, but we're building more churches. Myth number 3, let's talk about Jesus. I hear all the time, I see it on social media, I see it in news tabloids. Nobody knows who Jesus is. Sometimes you can hear like an old Southern preacher go, well, they don't know Jesus. Jesus is this foreign, unknown figure. People don't know who Jesus is. Well, we track this too. In the year 2000, this is a more evangelical kind of born-again statement. I've made a personal commitment to following Jesus that is important in my life today. We ask people, is this true of you? In the year 2000, 65% of Americans said that they had made a commitment to following Jesus, that was a commitment empowering their life. Today, 66%. And as you see, we've been writing on this over the past few months, that since the early pandemic, this number is actually steadily growing. The number of people who have made a commitment to following Jesus is in pretty incredible increase over just the last 5 years. But it did drop off from 65% in the year 2000 down to just 54% by 2021. But there's a increase, a significant increase happening over the last few years. But I thought nobody knew who Jesus was. That's the story I've been telling. But now you're telling me that 2 out of 3 people actually say that they have made a commitment to following Jesus. Well, let's dig a little deeper into that. What else would we think about when we hear that? Well, we asked this survey statement, this question in representative work. Would you say you personally have a positive, negative, or negative opinion of each of the following? And we asked this to all U.S. adults and thinking of the question, if most people say they're following Jesus, what do they actually not like? Well, what we find is that 71% of all U.S. adults have a very positive opinion of Jesus. Only 5% say they are negative towards the actual person of Jesus. 65% say, I'm very positive towards spirituality. 63% of all U.S. adults say they have a very positive opinion of Scripture. Even 57% say that I have a positive opinion of Christianity. So they're following Jesus, they like spirituality, they like the Bible. What don't they like? Oh, they even like the churches in their communities. 47% of them say, I like the churches in my community. I like the Christian pastors or priests. What happens in these 2 items when we get local is more neutrality comes up, where they have some people have less of a hard opinion, but it's not negativity. It's not that people don't like these things. They're just more likely to be neutral. What they don't like is mainstream Christianity. Evangelicalism. 27% say I am negative towards it, with 48% being neutral. Celebrity pastors, 1 out of 3 Americans say I'm very negative towards the idea of celebrity pastors, and 38%, almost 2 out of 5, say I'm very negative towards megachurches. Only 16%, 17% of all U.S. adults say they like megachurches or celebrity pastors. So there's something about the mainstream cultural Christianity that is maybe overriding the appeal people feel towards Jesus and spirituality and Scripture itself. Just to make a proof point on this, what if we cut out everybody in this bit of data who identifies as Christian or being religious, and we just looked at people outside of Christianity and outside of religion? So to look at atheists, agnostics, and people of no faith. This is what their chart looks like. So just looking at U.S. adults who identify as atheist, agnostic, or of no faith, for the most part, they lean positive on things like Jesus, spirituality, the Bible, Christianity. They have a lot more neutrality, not hostility, which is what we often hear. They're actually just more neutral towards these things. Where they actually get more hostile or more in disagreement is, again, around the mainstream Christianity, the cultural Christianity that we've been heard about in the news, heard about in tabloids and in journalism. 55% of people outside of the church say, I don't like this mega church thing. 54% say, I don't like that celebrity pastor thing. So how would we organize this? Maybe we'd say the myth is that people don't know who Jesus is. The truth is that adults overwhelmingly love Jesus. They like the person of Jesus. They would follow the person of Jesus. They question mainstream Christianity. They question the brand of Christianity, the Christianity they hear about on social media or in the news. They say, I like that Jesus guy. I even like that Bible thing. I just don't like what I'm hearing about this church thing. I don't like the story that's being told about this Christian thing. I don't like the influence of mainstream Christianity in the world today. Myth number 4, young people are done with the religion. Have we heard this? Young people drop out? Some head shakes. Christianity is generally on the decline as an identity. over the course of generations. So this is the percentage of all U.S. adults broken down by generation, from Gen Z to elders, who identify as being Christian. You can see that the boomer and elder generation, about 3 out of 4 of them identify as a Christian, where it says it's only about 56% of the Gen Z generation, 63% of the millennial generation. What's always interesting to look at in this data, though, is to recognize that the proportion of adults who identify with other religions, agnosticism, or atheism is relatively unchanged generation over generation. So they are less likely to identify as Christian as they get younger, but it's not that they're moving towards other religions, and it's not that they're moving towards atheism or agnosticism, which is what we often hear. It's actually that they're just dropping out of the religion thing altogether. They just don't want to identify as religious. They don't want to identify as being part of a certain group. So this is often referred to as the rise of the nones, N-O-N-E-S, people who just don't want to be affiliated with organized institutional religion. What's so fascinating about these generations, though, is that if you actually talk to them about their religious life, there is no difference across generations. Across all generations, between Gen Z and elders, they're just as likely to, on a weekly basis, this is weekly data, say that they pray. They're just as likely to say they attend church. They're just as likely to say they read scripture. Young people, we're actually seeing this a lot right now, are actually leading a post-COVID return to church. Whereas older adults, post-COVID, are tending to drop out more and more of church. But young people actually tend to be a little bit more spiritually inclined than older generations. So looking at this piece of data again, they don't want to identify, they don't want to be part of an organized institutional identity, but they're just as religious. They're just as spiritual as older generations. And so as church leaders, we need to maybe ask, well, what is that question? Why are we telling the story that they're so done with religion? They're just as spiritual, or why don't we celebrate that? Well, we need to go a little deeper into what do they actually feel about the church? What is it about organized religion that they don't enjoy? And so when you look at young people, this is specifically millennials today are 25 to 40 years old. If you ask those of them who do not identify as Christian what they feel about the church, they say, I would prefer to distance myself from the politics of the church. They say church teachings have flaws or gaps. They say things like, the church does not or cannot answer my questions. The church does not address my day-to-day needs, my day-to-day life in a useful way. And yet, down here at the bottom, 33% of millennials who have left the church said, and I would come back. I could see myself being involved in a church later in life. And so they are having these moments where they see the church as not being what they need it to be, and they especially want to get away from the politics of the church, so that an institutional identity tends to be lost on them, but the practices of church they tend to align with. They just say, I don't like this politics thing. One more interesting stat to bring this to life. We ask young people, what, if anything, makes you doubt Christian teachings? What actually makes you doubt the thing itself? And the number one thing they say is the hypocrisy of religious people is what makes me doubt. If you can read in this list, down towards the right, the thing that is the least likely to make them doubt Christianity is the resurrection of Jesus. They're fine with the resurrection of Jesus. They're fine with the theology. They often don't like us. They look at us and say, what you're teaching and how you're behaving, maybe even going back to that cultural Christianity and mainstream Christianity, does not line up. They like the person of Jesus. They find politics and hypocrisy in how they perceive Christians, how they know Christians in the world today. So if we were to review it, we would acknowledge that young people are done with religion. That's the story we've been told. The truth is that younger generations are just as religious and religiously inclined and spiritually inclined as older generations. What they're done with is political and hypocritical religion. They'd like something more authentic. There's a lot of complexity into what authenticity looks like in a digitally connected, hyper-informed world. We can discuss that a little bit, but we have to acknowledge the truth of the story is not that they're done with religion, they're done with certain types of religion. They're looking for something different, a new expression. Myth number 5, the future is digital. I think coming out of the pandemic, many of us have felt this pressure, this expectation that everything needs to be digital. We're going in a digital direction. When you talk to young people, what you find is that next generations are more convinced than anybody else that community, faith, and God can be found online. They say things like, I believe community can be formed online. I believe meaningful relationships can be built online. I can grow my faith online. I can experience God online. And I believe that I can grow closer to Jesus online. So next generations are saying, yeah, I could do this whole thing online. I don't need to be here in this beautiful room or around these people. So when you listen, that is what you hear. That is the story. They back it up. We ask them things like, is attending church online better or worse than attending church in person? Among all Christians, the majority say that attending church online is worse. 15% say of all Christians today say attending church online is better. If you look at Christian millennials, 42% of them say that there is no difference between attending church online or in person, whereas the boomer generation, 53% of them say that it's worse. How would you synthesize that? I would synthesize by saying next generations can't tell the difference. They cannot tell the difference between online church and in-person church, which to those of us who were raised in the church and have been around the church a long time, we hear that and go, well, how can you not tell the difference? Well, we have to acknowledge what is Christianity and how is it in its forms these days being delivered. When the church is reduced down just to content, a message to be received, and young people today are so overwhelmed with content and messages on their devices, how is this different than what they get on the couch at home? They don't know. Look at this one other way. At a Christian church, for each of the following, do you think it is more meaningful online or in person? This is among all Christians, and they overwhelmingly say that every single aspect, almost every single aspect of church life is more meaningful in person than online. But very few people actually say that these things are better online. What is interesting is the number of people who say that these things are the same online versus in person. So for example, 1 out of 5 people saying that the church can meet my physical needs the same online versus in person. The same amount said the church can provide me the same amount of emotional support, the same amount of community building, opportunities to serve or opportunities to lead, that these things are going to be the same online or in person. And at the very bottom, the thing that they are the least likely to say is more meaningful in person is a sermon. And 31% of them say there's no difference between getting a sermon online or in person. But ask yourself for a second, for the majority of modern history, what have we organized Church Sunday around? It's the sermon. And they're looking at the church and saying, well, what's the difference between me being at home and me being there in person if you're just going to organize around the sermon? To back this up with one more data point, we ask people, which of the following do you feel should be the purpose of a church's physical space? The purpose of the room itself, a beautiful room like this. Those top few responses, 40%, the number one thing among all U.S. adults they say the church's physical building should be for is a place of prayer, meditation, or reflection. The next response, providing a place for spiritual growth. Third, providing safety and security. Fourth, worship and fellowship. Fifth, community. They want the physical church to help them belong. Almost the bottom, one of the very last items is providing a place for religious leaders to teach. They can get content anywhere these days. They can get good ideas, helpful ideas, even unhelpful ideas anywhere today. They are looking at in the church today and they're saying, I don't get the difference between online and in person. And I don't know why we're organizing around sermons. I'm looking to belong. In synthesis, the future is digital. Most people actually prefer in-person church. People are becoming less able to distinguish the difference between physical and virtual church. They just look at the two and say, I don't see a difference. How as church leaders can we say, no, there is a difference by what they experience? This is the most popular one I get to talk about of myths. Pastors are burning out at extreme rates. Let me footnote, just because I'm naming it a myth doesn't mean it is true or untrue. We're going to work through the data. Who's felt some burnout in the last few years? Tepid hands, everyone goes up like this far. This is Gallup's data. Gallup is a really, really strong social and market research firm tracking workplace well-being, and they can really help us understand what's going on way out there, not just in the church. I love sharing this stat because it's this reminder. This is how they've tracked daily stress. So they ask people, did you experience the following feelings during a lot of the day yesterday? Stress. Today, the last time they collected this data in 2022, 44% of all US adults said, I felt very stressed yesterday. I bring this data up to acknowledge the fact that the workplace, I do believe that pastoring is a calling, it's also a job. The workplace is more stressful today than it has been at any point in contemporary history. There's a lot that goes into that, a lot of social theory is trying to unpack why that is. But we need to acknowledge that it's not just the job of the pastor that's becoming harder. All work is becoming harder. Let's look at pastors. We became really well known for this stat throughout the pandemic of asking pastors, have you given real serious consideration to quitting being in full-time ministry within the last year? At the beginning, midway through the pandemic, we found that it was about 29% of all Protestant pastors said, I'm thinking about quitting. That rose to about 42% by mid to late pandemic 2022, and as of September of last year, down to about 1 out of 3. A few things to acknowledge here. First, burnout, consideration of leaving pastoral ministry, very high. That's a lot of pastors maybe on the edge. What we can also acknowledge is that it's not entirely going away. This number in 2024 didn't drop down to 10% post-pandemic. It's kind of like it's becoming part of the normal. That sense of burnout or that sense of maybe I want to go do something else. If we track vocational satisfaction, how satisfied are you with your vocation as a pastor? Just about 10 years ago in 2016, 72% of pastors said that I'm very satisfied with my job. As of 2024, late 2024, 58%. It's a pretty considerable decline in satisfaction of being a pastor. And you can see that 2022 real dip there where it went very low and somewhat satisfied came up pretty high. The truth of what happened during the pandemic is that for the first time in most pastors' lives, they had vocational doubt. So what this looks like is at any time during your tenure in ministry, have you personally gone through a period when you significantly doubted your calling as a pastor or minister? In 2016, 76% of pastors said, no, I've never doubted my calling. Today, or 2023, 60% say, yes, I have. The pandemic was the first time that pastors really questioned, do I want to keep doing this? This inspiration of vocational doubt that overtook the church. In a sweeping mentality, that's significant, that we go from 3 out of 4 pastors saying, I've never doubted myself, I've never doubted this vocation, to now 6 out of 10 say, yes, I have. One of the things that we track at Barna is called human flourishing. Human flourishing is the combination of a person's finances, well-being, vocation, relationships, and faith. So we can separate out all the different aspects of a person's life and say, how are they doing? We then score it from 0 to 100. And you could think of this like public school grading. An A would be a 90 or above. You have a B range, C range, D range, and a failure range. So we would say that 0 to 70 is unhealthy. 70 to 90 is in the healthy range, 90 plus is flourishing. Ask yourself for a second, how do you think pastors are doing in these areas? So here are pastor scores. Pastors score very high on faith. They're doing really well in it. Next comes their vocational flourishing, 82 out of 100 of how well do they like their jobs and they feel like their job is providing them purpose in their life. They score a 70 on finances, so just into the healthy range, maybe right on the line of the healthy range. Health, physical health, and emotional health, both those go into that. 69, so just under healthy. And the lowest rated score is a 67 on relationships. So their total flourishing, their average, the average pastor is getting like a C in their overall well-being as a human. How does that compare to everybody else? Here are all U.S. adult scores in the same thing. All U.S. adults score a 67 on faith. Essentially no different on vocation, but pastors outscore them by just a little bit on their actual jobs. Pastors are getting a B-, whereas all U.S. adults are getting a C+. Finances, pastors actually outscore the average US adult. Health, essentially no different. US adults outscore just a little bit. I'm so interested in this one right here. Why do pastors score so incredibly lower on relationships than everybody else? One other way to think about this is practicing Christians. So these are the Christians who attend your church on a regular basis. They're people who are highly engaged in their faith life. They outscore all US adults on every single item, highly engaged Christians. They also tend to outscore pastors on almost every single item. So that is to say that the people we serve often flourish more than we ourselves as church leaders. But I want to call so much attention to this right here, that pastors on average fail on a grading system, relational well-being, whereas the people in our churches are actually pretty healthy when it comes to their relationships. Pastors, 1 out of 5 of them say, I frequently feel lonely or isolated, and 47% of them say, I feel this sometimes, which means that upwards of 6 out of 10 pastors are constantly feeling lonely or isolated. Only 30% of pastors say, I'm content with my friendships or in my relationships, and only 23% say that my relationships are as satisfying as I'd like them to be. That's a crisis in so many ways. So if we were to synthesize, pastors, the story we hear is that pastors are burning out at extreme rates. The truth is that the pandemic inspired widespread vocational doubt. But if we were going to look at a more accurate story of the state of the pastorate in the contemporary world, we'd say that pastors lack the relationships necessary to thrive. It's not that our jobs are burning us out so fast, it's that our jobs are burning us out just like everybody else's jobs. We don't have the emotional support needed to weather that storm. We're alone where other people get help. And based on some of the head nods I see, I understand that many of you understand this, but we have to be careful of the story that we're telling around what is it that pastors really need? Because if we went and designed a program around relieving burnout, are we going to build up the relationships we need to thrive? The last myth is about the relevance of the church. This is the one I feel like I've heard since I was a child, that the people don't believe the church is relevant anymore. And maybe take for a second and ask yourself, what do I think relevance means? What's relevant to you? What's relevant to your life? Think about the places you go with your day. Think about the things you purchase, maybe. Think about the ways you spend your money or your time. What's relevant mean? 2 out of 5 young Christians believe the church is irrelevant. Say it one more time. 2 out of 5 young Christians, highly engaged Christians, say this thing is actually pretty irrelevant to the world today. Church is no longer relevant in society. This is highly engaged Christians throughout. So even Christians say the church is not relevant. It's not that the world's saying that the church is irrelevant. It's actually we ourselves who are saying this church thing is not relevant. We saw a little bit of this data earlier, but I think it's worth bringing back up that trust of the institutional church is so low amongst next generations. Over half of young millennials say, I have a hard time trusting this institution. I'm skeptical of what I'm learning there. The church cannot answer my questions. The church does not answer my questions. So this is one that I look back on and I think of the story that we're telling, that the church is not relevant. And I'd say that's myth confirmed, right? Even we ourselves say that the church is not relevant. To pressure test this, I want to tell you a story. In a lot of my research, we get to travel the country and go do focus groups, go sit with church leaders, go sit with Christians all around the country. We bring them into spaces like this, and we talk to them about their church experiences. And we did this really neat study a few years ago. If you're interested in it, the publication version of it, it's called Making Space. And in Making Space, we did about 20 different focus groups all across the country where we went to churches of different styles, different denominations, different structures, and we did 2 different focus groups. One where we would bring in highly engaged Christians, and one where we'd bring in atheists. And specifically what we did in these focus groups is we allowed them to tour the church. Most specifically a sanctuary or auditorium space. So imagine right now you've got a bunch of random Christians touring this space, and then at another time you have a bunch of atheists touring a space like this. And let me tell you what happened in every single one of these groups. Christians would come into a space like this, And they'd walk around like they owned the place. They'd open up cabinets, they'd pull out the Bibles, they'd go all throughout the chancel and the pulpit, they'd find, they'd open up the AV, the audio-video booth, they'd check stuff out. And then when you ask them, what do you think of this space, they could only use the language of comparison. They'd say things like, well, the stained glass at my church is bigger. They'd say, my screens at my church are bigger. Our chancel is bigger. It's always the word bigger, larger. They'd talk about the audio technology, the audio and technology of the building. They'd say, my church is nicer. We've got nicer stuff. They walked around like they owned the place. They'd go anywhere. When we invited atheists in those same spaces, specifically when we brought them into sanctuary spaces, very similar to this one, they'd often sit quietly in the back. And they'd sit there quietly, and they'd ponder, and they'd listen. And they would walk around very somber, like they'd read every little plaque, the things that we all just look right over. They'd approach the chancel or the pulpit area, and they'd not touch it. They would not even put a foot on it. And when you ask them why, they'd say, I don't belong there. That's a sacred space. We took them into Catholic cathedrals, and they wouldn't touch a confessional booth. They'd say, I'm not Catholic. I don't belong there. Whereas Protestants and evangelicals would literally open the door and be like, oh, it's so cool in here. I've never been in one of these. Atheists would embrace these spaces as a place of deep reverence. They were not compelled to have a conversation of relevance or of comparison. We had this one gentleman who sat in the back of a church and cried and did not participate in the beginning of our focus group. And when we went and talked to him, he said, it's been 30 years since I've been in a church like this, and it smells just like my grandmother's church. And that is the safest place I've ever known. Why is it that in the pursuit of relevance, the church as an institution has sacrificed reverence? We don't build reverent spaces, we build relevant spaces. We've told people that the church should be relevant to them in the same way that we tell them that Apple or Amazon or Walmart should be relevant to them. That if this thing mattered to you, you'd go spend your time and money there. Whereas even the people outside of the Christian tradition look at these spaces and say, that's a really safe space that I wish I could be at more. And often they don't feel like they belong here. My last stat for you is one of my favorite stats. It's so simple. Next generations are looking to belong. 2 out of 3 young people today say, I long for a community where I can speak openly about my spiritual beliefs. People are looking for a place to belong, but if we, the church ourselves, have replaced the reverence of God and the reverence of safe spaces with a relevant pursuit that is often consumeristic, often focused on growth and on size, we will never convince people that they belong here or that they can connect to the divine in these spaces. So I want to acknowledge that the story is the church isn't relevant enough. We want to say the truth of this story is that even Christians say the church is not relevant enough. My question that I want to reorient around is, why is relevance the goal? Why have we sacrificed reverence in pursuit of relevance? Let me give you a bit of a wrap-up. Why should we pay attention to the stories that we tell, these myths, these organizing stories? And I think it comes down to one great quote and 4 ideas. The quote comes from Mark Twain, who said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. If a story is good, if we can organize around it, like the church is in decline, like churches are closing their doors, we're burning out, people don't like this thing, the future is digital, we will go that way, whether it is true or not. It's 4 main ideas. Whether they are true or not, we organize around stories. We organize around stories like Christianity is in decline, or pastors are burning out. And we overlook the truth of the matter, like the church is not declining, it's just not growing. And that pastors, yes, experience vocational doubt, but pastors lack the relationships necessary to thrive. We are defined by the stories that we tell. The Gospels in the New Testament are a point in case of this, that over the course of 2,000 years, we come back to those stories to say who we are. The fact of the matter is that we have allowed other stories and other mythologies to define us greater than the New Testament and the story of Christ. Third, we hit what we aim for. stories are often what we aim for. If we keep telling ourselves that we're in decline and we're on the way out, we will be on decline in the way out, and we will pursue growth over reverence. We will pursue relevance over reverence. And finally, I would say that the church is just in dire need of reorientation, to pick stories that compassionately, kindly, and authentically communicate who the church is and who a person is in the eyes of God, not through a bunch of myths that can be busted using just a few data points, but a story that communicates who you are and how God loves you and how this can be a safe and reverent place for you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. I'm so thrilled by the work that you do and look forward to spending the rest of the day with you. Thank you.